I never thought I'd have to arrest someone's child on my own property. But when Karen Morrison's entitled 16-year-old son broke into my barn at 3 in the morning, I realized some lessons can only be learned the hard way. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been the police chief of Willowbrook Ranch for the past 15 years. This is a story about how one mother's complete failure to teach her child boundaries nearly destroyed our peaceful community, and why sometimes justice comes in ways you never expect. Let me paint you a picture of Willowbrook Ranch. We're not your typical suburban neighborhood with white picket fences and HOA board meetings. We're a sprawling rural community of 37 families, spread across 2,000 acres of Montana wilderness. Each family owns anywhere from 10 to 50 acres, and we govern ourselves through a simple ranch association. I moved here 12 years ago with my late wife Sarah, seeking the peace and quiet that only wide-open spaces can provide. After 23 years as a city cop in Denver, I thought I was done dealing with petty criminals and entitled people who believed the rules didn't apply to them. Sarah and I built our dream home on 43 acres, complete with a working barn, a small cattle operation, and enough land to finally breathe. When Sarah passed 3 years ago from cancer, this ranch became more than my home. It became my sanctuary. The community rallied around me during those dark months, bringing casseroles and offering to help with the cattle. That's the kind of place Willowbrook Ranch was. We looked out for each other. That changed when Karen Morrison bought the Henderson property. Karen arrived last spring with her teenage son Dylan, driving a brand new Range Rover and immediately complaining about everything from our gravel roads to the sound of cattle lowing at dawn. She came from some upscale Denver suburb and made it clear she expected ranch life to conform to her city standards. The first sign of trouble came during our annual spring community barbecue. Every family contributes something: meat, sides, desserts, drinks. It's a tradition that goes back decades, and the unspoken rule is simple: bring enough to share, and everyone eats well. I'd spent 2 days smoking brisket, making my grandmother's secret dry rub, and preparing enough food to feed 40 people. Karen showed up empty-handed. "I assumed this was more of a potluck suggestion," she said, when Mrs. Chen politely asked what she'd brought. Dylan and I are on a very specific diet anyway. But that didn't stop them from loading their plates with everyone else's food, including taking an entire container of my brisket that I'd been saving for the elderly Johnson couple who couldn't make it to the barbecue. I should have said something then, but I was still adjusting to being the community's unofficial leader, and I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe city life was just different. Maybe she needed time to understand how things worked out here. I was wrong, and my silence that day would come back to haunt me in ways I never imagined. The problems with Karen escalated gradually, like water slowly eroding a riverbank. First, it was complaints about my cattle crossing the shared access road, a road that had been used by livestock for over 60 years. Then she demanded I install soundproof barriers because my rooster crowed too early. When I politely explained that roosters crow at dawn, regardless of human schedules, she threatened to file noise complaints with the county. But the real trouble started with Dylan. At 16, Dylan Morrison was everything wrong with entitled youth rolled into one lanky, smirking package. He drove a lifted truck his mother bought him, despite having his license for only 3 months. He'd tear down our peaceful gravel roads at 40 miles per hour, sending dust clouds into people's gardens and spooking livestock. When I approached Karen about her son's reckless driving, she became defensive. "Boys will be boys, Tom," she said, using that patronizing tone I'd come to despise. "Dylan's just expressing his independence. Maybe if you people had paved roads like civilized areas, this wouldn't be an issue." 3 weeks later, Dylan crashed his truck into the Yamamoto family's fence, letting their prize-winning horses loose. Instead of apologizing, Karen claimed the fence was improperly positioned and demanded the Yamamotos pay for Dylan's vehicle repairs. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with someone who simply didn't understand ranch life. We were dealing with someone who believed the world should bend to accommodate her and her son's behavior. The situation reached a boiling point in late October, just before our annual harvest festival. This wasn't just any community gathering, it was our biggest celebration of the year, a 3-day event where families from neighboring ranches joined us for food, music, and fellowship. I'd volunteered to coordinate the catering, which meant smoking meats for nearly 200 people. I spent 3 weeks preparing. I ordered premium beef from a local ranch, bought a dozen whole chickens, and even splurged on wild salmon from Alaska. My barn became a temporary smokehouse, with 3 industrial smokers running around the clock. The smell of hickory and mesquite drifted across the valley, and neighbors would stop by just to tell me how good everything smelled. 2 days before the festival, I had everything ready. Brisket, pulled pork, smoked chicken, salmon, and even smoked turkey for the families with dietary restrictions. Everything was wrapped, labeled, and stored in the walk-in cooler I'd installed in my barn, specifically for community events. That's when Karen knocked on my door with a request that should have sent up every red flag I possessed. "Tom, I need to ask you a huge favor," she said, wearing that fake smile I'd learned to distrust. "Dylan's been invited to a party tomorrow night. It's a really important social opportunity for him. The host family is very influential in Denver society." I waited for her to continue, already sensing where this was heading. "The thing is, they're expecting each guest to contribute something special to the meal, something unique and impressive." She paused, glancing toward my barn. "I was hoping you might let us take some of your smoked meats. Just a little bit. Dylan really needs to make a good impression." For a moment, I was speechless. This woman was asking me to give away food I'd prepared for our community festival, food that people were counting on so her son could impress some Denver socialites. "Karen, that food is for the harvest festival," I said as calmly as I could manage. "Families are driving here from 3 counties over. I can't give away food that people are expecting." Her expression shifted from fake sweetness to cold calculation. "It's just food, Tom. You can always make more. This party could change Dylan's future. The answer is no." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something dangerous flicker in her eyes. Something that told me this conversation was far from over. "We'll see about that," she said quietly, then turned and walked away. I should have known right then that Karen Morrison wasn't the type of person who accepted no for an answer. At 3:17 a.m. on the morning of the Harvest Festival, my security alarm went off. I'd installed a basic system after a series of thefts hit rural properties the previous winter. Nothing fancy, just motion sensors and cameras around the barn and main house. The alarm rarely triggered except for the occasional deer or curious raccoon, so when it woke me from a dead sleep, my first thought was that a wild animal had wandered too close to the building. I pulled on my clothes and grabbed my flashlight, not bothering to check the security feed on my phone. If I had, I might have prevented what happened next. The barn doors were wide open, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I always secured those doors, especially when storing food for community events. As I stepped inside and flicked on the lights, my heart sank. My walk-in cooler stood open, and more than half of the smoked meats were gone. Not just grabbed, hastily, carefully selected and removed. The expensive cuts, the premium items I'd spent weeks preparing. Someone had taken the time to choose exactly what they wanted, leaving behind the less desirable pieces. But they'd made one crucial mistake. Dylan Morrison was still there, loading the last of my smoked salmon into a cooler in the back of his truck. "Stop right there," I called out, my voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement. Dylan froze like a deer in headlights, then slowly turned around. In the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the barn, he looked exactly like what he was, a scared kid who'd gotten in over his head. "Chief Bradley," he stammered, "I can explain. You're on my property at 3 in the morning, stealing food I prepared for our community festival." I kept my voice level, professional. "What exactly do you think you can explain?" That's when Dylan made the mistake that would change everything. Instead of admitting what he'd done, instead of apologizing and begging for a second chance, he doubled down on his family's entitlement. "My mom said you wouldn't miss it. She said you always make too much food anyway, and this party is really important for my future. These people could help me get into a good college." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, something much more dangerous. The kind of calm that comes when you realize you're dealing with someone who fundamentally doesn't understand right from wrong. "Your mother told you to steal from me?" "It's not stealing," Dylan said quickly. "It's just borrowing. We were going to pay you back." "With what? Money? More food? Or were you planning to just pretend this never happened?" Dylan's silence told me everything I needed to know. I pulled out my phone and started recording. As a police officer, I'd learned long ago to document everything, especially when dealing with entitled families who might later claim harassment or abuse. "Dylan Morrison, you're on my property at 3:17 a.m. without permission, removing food from my barn that you don't have permission to take. Do you understand that this constitutes theft and breaking and entering?" The color drained from his face. "You can't arrest me. I'm just a kid, and you're not even a real cop anymore. This is just some stupid ranch." That's when I realized this family's problems ran much deeper than simple entitlement. They genuinely believed that rules, laws, and consequences were things that happened to other people. "Dylan, I want you to call your mother right now." "Why?" "Because she's about to learn that actions have consequences, and some lessons can't be bought, bullied, or bargained away." What happened next would expose the true depth of Karen Morrison's character and why some people should never be trusted with authority over others. Karen arrived 23 minutes later, still in her pajamas, but somehow managing to look imperious and outraged. She stormed into my barn like she owned the place, already talking before she'd even assessed the situation. "Tom Bradley, this is completely unacceptable. Calling me at this hour over some misunderstanding between children." "Mrs. Morrison," I interrupted, holding up my hand. "Your son broke into my property and stole food I prepared for our community festival. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a crime." She looked around the barn, taking in the open cooler, the missing food, and Dylan standing next to his truck loaded with stolen goods. For just a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. But then her entitled worldview reasserted itself. "Crime?" She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Tom, let's be reasonable here. Dylan is 16 years old. This is just a teenage prank that got out of hand. Surely we can work something out between neighbors. Your son committed breaking and entering, theft, and trespassing. As the chief of police for this jurisdiction, I have an obligation to handle this according to the law. You're not a real police chief." Dylan suddenly burst out. "This is just some fake ranch cop job." Karen's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment at her son's outburst or anger at me, I couldn't tell. "Dylan's right," she said carefully. "You're a security officer for a private community. You don't have real authority here." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet, removing the card I'd hoped never to have to show in this community. My Montana Peace Officer Standards and Training Certification, along with my commission as a sworn police officer for rural Cascade County. "Mrs. Morrison, I am a fully commissioned police officer with arrest powers throughout this county. This ranch falls under my jurisdiction, and I take theft very seriously." The blood drained from Karen's face. "Now," I continued, We have several options here. Option 1, I arrest Dylan for breaking and entering, theft, and criminal mischief. He gets fingerprinted, photographed, and spends the rest of the night in juvenile detention while we wait for family court to open on Monday. Dylan made a small whimpering sound. Option 2, Dylan returns every piece of food he stole, writes a formal apology to the entire community, and performs 100 hours of community service, helping with ranch maintenance. You, Mrs. Morrison, will pay for all the food that's been contaminated or damaged, and both of you will attend a community meeting where you'll explain your actions to your neighbors. Karen's jaw clenched. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out if there was some angle she could work, some way to turn this situation to her advantage. And if we choose neither option? She asked. Then I arrest you both. Dylan for theft, you for conspiracy and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Because Dylan's already told me this was your idea. That's not. Dylan started to protest, but Karen cut him off with a sharp look. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen Morrison looked genuinely afraid. Not angry, not indignant afraid. She was finally beginning to understand that her wealth, her attitude, and her sense of entitlement couldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions. We need time to think about this, she said finally. No, I replied firmly. You need to decide right now. Because in about 3 hours, families are going to start arriving for a festival that your son tried to ruin. They're expecting food that he stole. Every minute we waste here is another minute I'm not spending trying to salvage this situation. Karen looked at Dylan, then back at me. I could see her weighing her options, trying to find some way to maintain her dignity while accepting defeat. If we choose option 2, she said slowly, this stays between us? No police record? This stays within our community, but your neighbors deserve to know what happened. Trust has to be rebuilt, Mrs. Morrison. That doesn't happen in secret. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, something had changed. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of shame. Dylan, she said quietly, start unloading the truck. But the story wasn't over yet. Because, as I would soon discover, some people can't change their nature even when facing consequences. And Karen Morrison had one more card to play that would test everything I believed about justice, mercy, and second chances. The Harvest Festival was a success, despite everything. Word of what had happened spread through the community faster than I'd expected, but instead of anger, our neighbors responded with typical ranch solidarity. The Yamamoto family brought extra vegetables from their greenhome, arrived with enough fried rice to feed an army. Dylan spent the entire festival helping serve food, his face red with shame every time someone thanked him for his help. I watched him carefully, looking for signs that he was learning from this experience. Slowly, tentatively, I began to see glimpses of the decent kid he might become if someone finally taught him that actions have consequences. Karen, on the other hand, remained largely absent. She attended the mandatory community meeting the following Tuesday, made a brief, obviously rehearsed apology, and wrote a check for the damaged food without making eye contact with anyone. She fulfilled the letter of our agreement, but it was clear that she still saw herself as the victim in this situation. The real change came 3 weeks later. I was in town picking up feed supplies when I ran into Dylan at the hardware store. He was alone, looking at ranch tools with the kind of focused attention I'd never seen from him before. "Chief Bradley," he said when he noticed me. Can I ask you something?" "Sure, son." "That night in your barn. You could have arrested me, couldn't you? I mean, really arrested me, not just threatened to?" I studied his face, seeing genuine curiosity instead of his usual defensive hostility. "Yes, I could have. And honestly, Dylan, part of me wanted to. What you did was wrong, and it hurt people who've been nothing but kind to your family." He nodded slowly. "My mom keeps saying you were just trying to scare me, that you never would have actually done it. What do you think?" Dylan was quiet for a long moment, turning a hammer over in his hands. "I think you would have, and I think maybe I needed you to." That conversation marked a turning point for Dylan. He started showing up at my barn on weekends, asking if there was work he could do. Not court-ordered community service, just a kid trying to learn how to be better. I taught him how to properly care for cattle, how to maintain equipment, how to take pride in hard work done well. His mother never acknowledged the change in her son, and she never thanked me for giving him a second chance instead of a criminal record. Karen Morrison remained convinced that she and her family were the victims of an unfair, backwards community that didn't appreciate their sophistication. That might have been the end of the story, except for what happened 6 months later. Karen put her property up for sale in early spring, claiming she'd found a better opportunity in California. She listed the land for twice what she'd paid for it, apparently believing that the improvements she'd made, mostly cosmetic changes that disrupted the natural landscape, had dramatically increased its value. No one in our community could afford her inflated asking price, and out-of-state buyers weren't interested in remote Montana ranch land that came with horror stories about difficult neighbors. The property sat on the market for months, with Karen growing increasingly bitter about our small-minded, jealous community that was supposedly sabotaging her sale. Dylan had a different plan. He'd spent months working odd jobs around the ranch, saving every penny he earned. On his 17th birthday, he approached me with a proposal that knocked me sideways. "Chief Bradley, I want to buy our property from my mother." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "Dylan, son, that property is listed for $400,000. I know. And I know I don't have that kind of money." He pulled out a carefully prepared folder. "But I've been talking to Mr. Henderson at the bank, and he says there are programs for young farmers. Grants, loans, things like that. If I had someone willing to co-sign, someone with a good reputation in the community." It took me a moment to understand what he was asking. "You want to buy your mother's land so you can stay here?" "I want to be a rancher, Chief Bradley. A real one. I want to raise cattle and contribute to this community instead of taking from it. I want to be the kind of person you tried to teach me to be." That night, I called Karen to discuss her son's proposal. Her reaction was exactly what I'd expected. "Absolutely not. Dylan is going to college in California, not wasting his life playing cowboy in this godforsaken place. And I certainly won't accept some lowball offer just because he's gotten sentimental about manual labor. Karen, he's offering you fair market value based on comparable sales in the area. Your current asking price is what the property is worth," she interrupted. "Just because these people don't have money doesn't mean I should sell for less than it's worth." I tried reasoning with her, explaining that Dylan had found his place in our community, that he'd grown into a responsible young man who deserved a chance to build his own future. But Karen Morrison was incapable of seeing her son as anything other than an extension of her own ambitions. 3 days later, Dylan turned 18. Under Montana law, that made him an adult with the right to make his own decisions about his future. It also meant he could take legal action against a parent who was preventing him from accessing opportunities that were rightfully his. I won't go into the legal details, but let's just say that when a young man has documentation showing months of steady employment, a concrete business plan, and the support of an entire community, courts tend to take his petition for emancipation very seriously, especially when his mother's objections are based solely on social aspirations rather than his best interests. Karen Morrison left Montana 6 weeks later, alone. She sold the property to Dylan for exactly what she'd originally paid for it, after a judge pointed out that her improvements had actually decreased the land's agricultural value. She never said goodbye to her neighbors, never acknowledged the role our community had played in helping her son become a man, never admitted that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what really mattered in life. Dylan, meanwhile, threw himself into ranching with the passion of someone who'd found his calling. He worked harder than anyone I'd ever seen, determined to prove that he deserved the second chance he'd been given. Within a year, he'd restored the property to working ranch standards and was raising his own small herd of cattle. Last month, Dylan asked me to be his best man at his wedding. He's marrying Sarah Chen, whose family Karen had dismissed as those Asian people when she first arrived. Sarah's studying to be a veterinarian, and together they're building exactly the kind of life that Karen Morrison would have sneered at: simple, honest, and deeply rooted in community. As I watched them exchange vows in the same barn where I'd once caught Dylan stealing my food, I thought about second chances and the strange ways that justice sometimes works. Karen Morrison had tried to teach her son that he was above consequences, that rules were for other people, that taking what you wanted was acceptable as long as you had the right reasons. Instead, she'd given him the greatest gift possible, the chance to learn that she was wrong. Sometimes, the best thing that can happen to a person is discovering that their parents' values won't protect them from the real world. Sometimes you need to lose everything you thought you wanted to find out who you really are. Dylan Morrison learned that lesson at 16 in my barn, surrounded by stolen food and facing real consequences for the first time in his life. It changed everything for him. His mother never learned it at all. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. It's a reminder that we never know how our actions might change someone's life, for better or worse. Karen Morrison thought she was teaching her son to take what he wanted from the world. Instead, she taught him that some things are worth working for, worth earning, worth building slowly and carefully with your own hands. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever had to make a tough choice between easy justice and harder mercy? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more tales from rural life, where simple choices can have complex consequences. And sometimes, the people who seem most lost are the ones most capable of finding their way home.